All right, guys. Guys, this is Abhijit Trivedi. Well, I'm with Justin Thompson, owner of Gather STR. By the way, this is Abhijit from Lord of the Ins. We're going to be starting. Today's session is going to be really exciting because there are so many concepts. Which this creative financing is one concept which people might have heard of here and there, but in practice, they don't really know how to kind of implement it or how to execute it and really practically buy a property. Okay. Now you might have heard of BRRRR strategy, right? The buy, rehab, rent, refinance, repeat. So that one involves banks, but this is an even more advanced strategy where you don't involve banks. Like think outside the bank. So before starting, I would want to actually thank you so much, Justin, to actually spend your time and coming here to share your knowledge. And if you can start with like, what's your background? What did you do before you were in real estate? I know what got you started in real estate. If you can share that.
Yeah, absolutely, Abhijit. Thank you for having me on. I know I got some mentorship hours from you later last year, so I appreciate you reconnecting with me. So, yeah, my name's Justin Thompson. I go by JT. I spent 18 years in automotive engineering. I'm from Michigan, so I studied electrical engineering. I know there's a lot of engineers in this group here, so I thought I'd mention that. But I worked on electric vehicles for a number of years and gradually on the side started to get into real estate. So I bought some long-term rentals back in 2006 and 2008 and held on to those and built up some small equity in that. And then I eventually rolled that into short-term rentals starting in 2021. And I bought three short-term rentals at that time. And of course, in 2021, it was pretty easy to buy and you could put anything on the market and everything was great and easy. And then I, got into that and started doing it more and, saw the vision that maybe this could be full time and started to look for ways that I could scale up. But I was, of course, low on capital at that point in time. So I became interested in creative finance deals where you're buying properties for low entry, low out of pocket, low capital. And I ended up in 23, I joined the Sub 2 community, which is Pace Morby's creative finance community. And within that community, connected with some people who were doing short term rentals. And I ended up buying a zero entry short term rental property in 23, which I have a slide
Okay.
on so I can show you the details of
Mhm.
that. Um, but I got into that for zero out of pocket and then depreciated it in 23 with bonus depreciation and the short-term rental loophole. So I was able to generate some capital from that. And then I went on and bought another three subject to properties where you take over the mortgage of the existing seller of the lender from the existing seller. So I was able to buy those for low entry and then also depreciate those and basically bought those four properties with ultimately essentially little to no out of pocket after all the tax savings. So it's around $3.7 million of properties. So
Wow.
I can show you all the details of that. Um, and then, as I was looking for deals, we refined our process. We became good at it. I formed a team with my partner, Zaheda Ahmed. She's Indian. I know there's some Indian people on the call here. So she's Indian. Her and I are 50-50 partners in our business. And we go out and we find creative finance deals for short-term rentals, mostly existing short-term rentals. And then we have a network of buyers who we, place those properties to. So we call ourselves acquisition specialist, and we get those properties and we put them under contract, and then we assign the contract to buyers. And so that's one of our businesses. We also do some co-hosting, property management, and we do some transaction coordination and so on. And we recently launched a community within the Circle platform called Gather STR. And there we post our deals and it's free to access it. And we're also adding some content in for, how to be a good host and how to optimize your operations and things like that so that there's resources for our buyers. A lot of our buyers are new investors, new to short-term rentals, so they need support for different systems and operations and things like that. So yeah, so that's my history. And yeah, I connected with you, Abhijit, last year. I've been in a number of different mentorship programs and sought out support from many different people, and you were one of them last year. So thanks for that boost along the way. And yeah, I've been in, I don't know, countless different mentorship programs that just try to pick up all the tidbits that you can from each thing to become a
Fantastic.
good operator. And that kind of brought me up to where I'm at today.
No, that's awesome. I mean, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I mean, I know like everybody has something to offer, so you want to actually pick up, wherever whoever has that expertise, you just want to get more knowledge from there, right? So definitely. Now from your response, there were actually a lot of things that were kind of new. So I'm just gonna try to like break it down. So one thing which you mentioned that after you bought the properties, you actually did this bonus depreciation, right? So that's basically the cost segregation thing which we try to do with those accelerated depreciation, right? So we actually do a cost study and then try to get whatever 5, 10, 15-year depreciation, we try to get it within the first year. And that way we can like offset a lot of the income, right? So that's a great strategy. I mean, I actually would recommend it to our investors too, so that they can kind of offset their W-2 income as well. So yeah, that's fantastic. And then you mentioned about seller financing, sub two and all. So can you quickly maybe talk about what are like the key differences between seller financing, then sub two, and there's something called as wraparound mortgages, right? In simple terms for beginners. So most people here in the audience, they've just done conventional financing so far. So if you can share like the differences and how do
Yeah.
you can get started, yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the bonus depreciation because in creative finance, it becomes a huge factor. So this year you save anywhere from 2 to 5% of the purchase price in taxes. And if your entry costs are 5% or 10% or even zero, that 2 to 5% that you're saving in taxes becomes a huge part of the overall investment. And so that's something that is unique to creative finance, where we're getting these deals for 10% or less total entry typically, that the bonus depreciation becomes a pretty significant factor of that value. And I'll show you that as well in the slides. Um, and then I'm sorry, your second question, I answered your first one.
Yeah, so second one was like, no, but what
Oh,
are what are some of the key differences between like
yeah,
self-financing, sub to wraparound mortgages? And
yeah.
so we can actually talk about it with an example of, let's say there's a property that's $500,000, right? So how
Yeah,
does that apply compared to 20% down?
right. So, subject to is a form of purchasing the property while leaving the existing mortgage in place. So you buy the property and the seller, you get the rights to the property, so you own it, you have the right to depreciate it, you have the right to do everything you want with the property, you own it outright. But there's a mortgage that stays in the seller's name and you make the payments to that mortgage. And the agreement is that you own that property as long as you make the payments. And there's oftentimes a balloon payment where you might have the seller might have, let's say, 27 years left on their mortgage, but there might be a balloon payment that's due in 10 years, where at that point you either refinance it and do a cash out refi and pay off the seller, or you sell the property and pay off the seller with the proceeds of the sale. So that's in effect what a subject to mortgage is, or subject to transaction. Um, then there's subtle differences between a subject to wrap and a subject to hybrid. So
Mm-hmm.
a subject to hybrid is where, let's say it's a $500,000 house and the seller has a mortgage for 350,000, but you say, okay, I'll give you $50,000 and I need you to finance the other 100,000. So that's called a subject to
Mhm.
hybrid. There's a $350,000 loan with a lender,
Mhm. Mhm.
and then there's a $100,000 loan between you and the seller. So that's a subject to hybrid. A wrap is where you wrap those things into a new mortgage. So in a subject to hybrid, you're effectively making two payments, one to the lender and one to the seller.
Mhm.
In a wrap, you would wrap those two elements into, let's say, one $450,000 note between you and the seller, and you make the payment to the seller, and the seller makes the payment to the bank, and then keeps the delta, which would have been the equivalent of the payment on the $100,000.
I see.
So they're all effectively forms of subject to. It's just a difference of whether or not there's some additional equity that is being financed. And
Mhm.
oftentimes there is because, as we're negotiating, if you had to give that seller 150,000, which is 30% of the value of the property, it wouldn't be a good deal typically. But if
Mhm.
you give them 50,000, which is 10% of the value of the property, then it can be a good deal. So
Okay.
oftentimes there's an element of a hybrid portion, which is then seller financing that's not financed by the underlying mortgage.
Okay. Okay. Got it. Got it. So now regarding the subject to hybrid and wraparound, right? So in wraparound, if it's just one mortgage and you pay everything to seller, so is it actually higher risk? Because what if like the seller stops paying to the bank, then
Yeah, there's lots of ways to mitigate risk.
Mhm.
One of them is you get a servicing company, so you have, just like your lender typically has a servicing company with an online portal where you log in
Mhm.
and you can
Mhm.
see the status. The servicing company is actually the entity that makes the payment to the lender. And so
Okay.
you pay the servicing company and the servicing company pays the lender.
Mhm.
Um, and that's a risk mitigating thing.
Okay.
Um, and then also, there's an advanced form of doing subject to within a trust where
Mhm.
the seller forms a trust
Mhm.
and the buyer becomes a beneficiary of the trust.
Mhm.
And in that structure, it significantly reduces the risk of a due on sale clause. So
Right.
most lenders in the US that are not government, FHA or VA loans,
Mm.
most of them have a due on sale clause within their mortgage terms that says that
Can
if
you also
you sell the
explain that?
property,
Yeah. So yeah.
yeah, if you sell the property, you must pay off the mortgage.
Mm.
So the trust is a way of mitigating the risk of a due on sale because transferring a property into a trust is a normal asset planning strategy. And so it happens quite often, and banks are pretty used to it. And they say, okay, you just transferred into a trust. That's a normal thing.
Okay.
And so when the seller does that, it is less of a flag to the bank. And therefore, it lowers the risk of the due on sale. And
Okay.
then in addition to that, if the buyer defaults, you can write terms within the trust that expedites the delivery of the property back to the seller. And so there's less risk for the seller, which means we get a higher acceptance rate from
Mm.
sellers. If we can reduce their risk, then more sellers will agree to those types of terms, and we get
Okay.
a higher acceptance rate for the terms. So
Okay.
doing them within a trust is something that we have started to do and recommend for all subject to transactions.
Okay. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, that's actually a lot of information. So, I mean, it seems like for all of these calculations and structuring the deals, you probably just can't do. do it yourself? Like, do you probably employ some real estate attorney or somebody to draft contracts, or like, or and then who do you really look for? Because not every attorney will be familiar with all this.
Yeah, we have for the trust, we have an attorney that we work with often that's done,
Hmm.
I don't know how many, probably 10,000 of these over the
Hmm.
last 30 or 40 years.
Okay.
He's been at it for a really long time. He
Okay.
um he kind of chuckles because the sub two community made subject to popular over the last 3 to 4 years,
Hmm.
but he's been doing it for decades within a trust, and so it's
Okay.
he's got a very proven process there,
Awesome.
um, and he's a great resource.
Okay.
So yeah, we use him often for the closing documents, but it goes through a title company, so the title company handles the escrow of funds. So the money that gets sent in for the purchase gets handled through a title company, just like a normal transaction.
Hmm.
And so you have protection there for some of those things like just the money transfer part of it.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Now, actually, before going on to the next questions, I mean, you mentioned that you have some case studies to go through, right? So I think it would
Yeah.
actually make more sense to the audience too if you can explain it what exactly this is, and then we can resume questions. Let me make you the host, or so that you can share. Uh, okay. Go ahead. You can share screen.
Okay. 1 second. Let me see. I have the ability to put it
Yeah,
on
they can see the
here.
screen now.
You can see my screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Let me just pull this down. Just trying to do this in a way that I could stay on here and
Yeah.
sh-
So, and if you can also like walk us through this each line, because most of us are just familiar with the 20% down thing. So, if you can,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. Sure.
So are we able to make my screen the main screen? Can we do that? Spotlight for everyone there. How's that?
Yeah, it's much better.
Okay, well, let me just make this a little bit bigger. Okay. Okay, so I had mentioned that I purchased a property in 23 for zero out of pocket, and this is that property. So this is a 5 bedroom, 4 bathroom. It's in Broken Bow, Oklahoma. It was already furnished. Um, so the purchase price was 949. It included approximately 65,000 in furnishings. So I paid zero out of pocket, and then I was paid. I received 37,000 at closing, and there was about 30,000 in startup expenses. So I purchased the sauna that you see in the upper right picture, and fixed up some things, got some new outdoor furnishings, and so on. So
You had
my
you had
total,
37K back at close, meaning was there some seller credits, or based on inspection you gonna add some?
okay, so the seller carryback transaction, the way it works is the buyer gets a loan for 80% of the purchase price from a DSCR lender.
Right.
Okay. So you have one loan from a DSCR lender that's 80%. Then the seller, after that transaction's completed, the seller lends the buyer back something around 30 to 35% of the purchase price. So you have one loan for 80% and one loan for 35%, let's say. The 35% covers the 20% down payment plus the 5% closing cost, plus some transactional fees, plus some cash in pocket typically. So that's where that 37,000 came from. It was from a loan between me and the seller
Hmm.
that was left over after everything else was paid for.
And that's
Okay.
called seller carryback. Is that what you
Yeah,
said?
this is a seller
Okay.
carryback
Okay.
transaction. So
Okay.
it creates a zero entry situation, but then also cash in the pocket at closing, typically. Not always, but typically. So so I walked out of the closing office with 37,000 in hand. Then I went and fixed some things up. I spent about 30,000 on a sauna and some other things. So my total net entry was negative 7,000. I had 7,000 left over after all of that. Okay.
Mhm.
Then this was in 23. It was 80% bonus depreciation in that year. The cost seg came back at 34%. So I had a taxable income reduction of around $258,000.
Wow,
Okay.
fantastic. So that was the cost like for the entire purchase, right? For the 9.9. And
Yeah.
and
Yep.
then what is this second cost like? The
The
one.
second line is the actual tax savings. So I saved around 100,000 in
Oh, okay.
taxes that year.
Okay, I see. Because of the
So
258K of taxable income reduced, you were able to save about 104K, right? Awesome. Yeah.
yep. So then I remember we have the one DSCR loan, we have the seller financing loan. I think this number is actually incorrect. It's from a different slide, but okay. So then we have um, about 150K of gross revenue, which is about 10K of cash flow. So what you'll notice with these seller carrybacks is the cash flow is typically pretty light. There are some scenarios where if you get enough back, let's say 50 or 60,000, you could go in and put a pickleball court or a pool, something that's really going to juice up revenue, and maybe you can force some cash flow. But they're typically light on cash flow. Um, but if you look at the number, so this is about 10K cash flow. So it's close to break even. It's about 10K cash flow. So my total net entry with tax savings was about minus 111. So I basically, with
Mhm.
tax savings and with the 7K that I had left over, I have about
Wow.
$111,000 that was generated from this deal.
Wow.
So if you look down here, I got to get out of the way now.
Mhm.
Um, that's not going to work. I got to move my body. 1 second.
Yeah, I think
I'll
we
come up
can.
here.
Okay. Yeah.
So if you look down here, we have, minus 111K entry. So that's cash in pocket. Now we look at the three values that generate wealth from these properties. One is appreciation, the second is principal pay down, and the third is cash flow. So it's about typically on average in the US, housing appreciates at 4% over every 20-year period. It's roughly 4%. So I always use 4% for these. That could go up or down, but over a 20-year average period of time, it's typically 4%. On these interest rates, it's principal paydowns usually right around 1%. And in this case, cash flow was around 1%. So between those three values, it's 6% of the purchase price, which was around $56,000 in net benefit per year um, from the initial first year. So if you look at this deal, you get 111 back out of it of positive capital, let's say, and then you have 6% return, which is about 56,000 per year. Now, of course, every year, the appreciation may not show up, but if you have a 10-year time horizon, it's typically 4%. And so that's where this 56,000 per year takes place. Okay. So this is a seller carryback. It allows a couple of things. It allows you to focus on the depreciation and generating capital. It allows you to buy property, which gives you appreciation and principal paydown, and it gives you a small to zero amount of cash flow. Okay. So
Yep.
on its own, this deal is okay. Most people look at cash flow as the most important thing. The way I look at properties is I stack them together, and I'll show you as I stack this property with other cash flowing properties, you can see how the values play together. Those properties will not generate capital, they will deplete capital, but they'll generate more cash flow. And I'll show you that on the next slide. We go to this one.
Just for this one on this slide now, it says, right, just for the audience too. So it says 125K interests on only seller finance loan at 7% with
That
5.
line item's incorrect. That's
Okay.
it was actually more than that. That's just it came from this slide here. It was
Okay. So now
copied.
this would be an interest-only loan, and then basically what it means is that it's not going to pay any of the principal amount, but then at the end of 3 or 5 year, you're going to be paying that balloon payment back to the seller, right? So how do you typically afford that balloon payment? And like, do you actually refi the property at the end, or?
Yeah, the way you do the balloon is, well, typically you focus on trying to get as long a balloon as possible, because
Mhm.
if you stay in the market and you're appreciating at 4% per year, over
Mhm.
5 years, that might be 21 or 22%. Over 10 years, that's like 44%. And so as you stay in the market, you
Mhm.
hope to appreciate enough
Okay.
to be able to refi out of it. Yeah. And
Okay.
most of the balloons we do now are on the longer side of
Okay.
like 7 to 10 years. Most of them are.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So then when you refi, you will just pay off that seller finance loan, but not the first subject to loan, or basically you'll have
Okay,
like.
so that deal that I just described, it wasn't subject to, so it was a new
Mm-hmm.
DSCR
Mm-hmm.
and a seller finance portion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Typically, you would let it appreciate, and then you would pay off both the
Both loans.
previous
Okay.
DSCR
Got it.
and the seller finance and
Okay.
get a new 80% LTV loan.
Hmm.
That's a typical exit.
Okay.
If you don't appreciate enough, you do have the option of selling the property. If you, let's say you needed 23% to appreciate, but you only appreciated 12, you could
Mm-hmm.
decide to sell the property and take the 12% and be done with it.
Hmm.
Or you could bring money into the deal. So there's multiple exits at the balloon, but we typically try to get longer balloons so that you have a better chance of appreciation during that period of time.
Okay. Okay. Great. Yeah. Sure. Go ahead.
Okay, so this was another deal that I purchased. This was again furnished 5 bedroom in Fort Lauderdale. Purchase price was 1.27. It included 95,000 in furnishings. I put 125 down on it and spent about 10,000 in startup expenses, so 135 total expense on this property, which if you look, it's just north of 10% to buy a furnished property. So it's, again, this is the type of thing that creative finance gives you, these entry costs that are closer to 10 or less percent, which is really one of the keys for getting super high return on investment. So um, this one cost save came back about 25%. So I saved about 78,000 in taxes in this case. This I took over a interest only loan subject to at 8.75%, which is on the high side, but it gives me room to refinance into a better P&I payment later down the road.
So typically subject to are when you assume the previous owner's mortgage, right? So how,
Yeah.
how is that an interest only subject to? To
The owner had an interest only loan with their lender, so that's just what they
Hmm.
had.
So then it might have a balloon payment after like how many years then? Um,
There was no balloon on this one, so it didn't have a balloon.
okay, yeah, that's
All
pretty
right, so
awesome.
then there was 125,000 interest only seller financing. This property will do about 185K,
Hmm.
which is about 40K cash flow. So then again, my net entry was 135 minus 78 in tax savings. So that was about 57K. Um, one second, let me just get it. Oops. I had to turn my Slack off. It's dinging at me over here. Uh,
No, but this is fantastic. And you had 78K tax savings, so 57K net, which is great. Um, this is
so, okay. Then again, if we look,
So we have a question from Hardik. Let me see. So we have a question from Hardik is like, does the expenses include the true interest payments? So the 40K cash flow is after both the interest payments?
yeah, yeah, that's after both debt service for the two loans. This is a subject to hybrid, so the
And that's
subject
the
to
annual cash flow, right? The 40K is the,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. So all right, so on this one, it was a 57K entry. Again, 4% appreciation. This one is interest only, so 0% principal pay down. 3% cash flow. Cash flow's a little bit higher on this. So that's about a 7% annual return, including those three values, or 89,000 roughly annual return on a 57K investment. So that's around, let's say 150% or something in that range.
Hmm.
Okay, so there was that deal. And then,
And then another question for that is your goal to keep this property for 3 to 5 years and sell it and hope to gain appreciation or some other goal?
I don't intend to sell any of the properties. I don't have a timeline goal to sell them. I plan to accumulate. I own $7 million of assets now, and I want to get to 10 within the next year. And I may sell them and roll them with a 1031 exchange into a different property at some point, but I don't intend to sell properties to generate capital or anything
No,
in
these
the
are actually great properties. I mean, I would say these are like million-dollar properties and amazing, really good interior decor, and those are really, really good properties.
yeah.
I mean,
One of the things we look for is pre-furnished properties because
Mhm.
that's one of the big enablers. If you don't have to go and spend 5 to 10% to furnish a property,
Right.
and not only that is I just don't have time anymore if I'm buying
Mhm.
4 properties a year to go and spend
Mhm.
1 to 2 months,
Right.
launching a property. I just don't have the time anymore. So like this property I bought on a Monday and it was rented on Thursday. I spent 2 to 3 days there working and doing some stuff, cleaning it up and fixing a few things here and there. But it was rented by Thursday, and it's been rented ever since. So
Mhm.
that's one of the big benefits of buying furnished creative deals is that you can often turn them pretty quickly and get them online.
Right.
Okay, so this one, this is a subject to low interest. So this one, again, 875 purchase price, probably around 70,000 in furnishings. Took over this 200 or 798K sub two at 3.125% with a 15-year balloon. So this is a really comfortable subject to
Hmm.
with a low,
Yeah.
low interest payment. I spent about 83 down. There's no hybrid portion of this. There's no additional seller financing. It's only subject to.
Yeah,
I
so
spent
I'm kind of curious about that. So basically, the seller had actually recently purchased the property, so that you were able to get the entire thing as sub to.
Yeah, well, these interest rates were from, 21,
Hmm.
22
Right.
typically. So that's usually when they bought it, if they have that interest rate. And then, price action between then and now, oftentimes it spiked up a little bit and then fell back down. So there might have been a time where he had more equity in this and then, all of a sudden didn't have equity and so on. So um, it just varies. Every deal is unique. It could be that they overpaid at some point and the value dropped down. But the big thing here is that, taking over a 3% interest rate, a very big chunk of the P&I payment goes towards principal. And so, that's where if you look down at the bottom, 2% of the payment goes towards principal every year. So a more significant portion. When interest rates get around 6 and 7%, that number is usually around 1% principal pay down. But down around 2 to 3%, it's 2% principal pay down. Okay, so did a cost seg on this one, saved about 64,000. Cash flow on this is about 45K, which again, the subject to deals, typically you have higher cash flow because you have a lower P&I payment. But you have higher net out of pocket expenses, although in this case it's still pretty low at 29,000.
Mm-hmm.
So the net entry was the 93K that I spent out of pocket minus the 64 in tax savings was about 20, it should be 29K net entry. So on this one, if you assume 4% appreciation, 2% principal pay down, 5% cash flow, that's 11% annually or 96K annually. So this was a phenomenal deal because
Yeah,
that's around 300%
really
return
good. Really
on
good.
the net investment, and it's locked in for 15 years with no seller financing, so it doesn't need to be paid back
Yeah, that's
anytime.
actually one thing which I see. Do you think that it seems like the sellers might have purchased as a burst strategy, and then as soon as they kind of rehabbed it, they would have refinanced it, and that's why you were able to get this at this price? Because
Every
typically,
situation is very unique. I don't think they intended to burr this. I think they just bought it. And
hmm,
in this particular market, the management fees are really high. They're like 25 to 35%.
wow, that's
And so what's a really good deal for somebody who's self-managing is
hmm,
a really bad deal for somebody who's paying 35%
hmm,
management fee,
hmm,
so it's pretty easy to find people that want to sell their properties there because they're getting them managed and they're paying a high fee for it.
hmm.
But then if you're willing to self-manage, you can take advantage of that, and that's basically what I'm doing here.
Okay, okay. Um,
So okay, so yeah, there's now we have these numbers, and if you remember at the beginning, I said, okay, let's think about these carrybacks as supplemental, and so I'm going to move my head out of the way again. So here now we have the three deals stacked up. So we have, minus 111K net entry with 56K total annual return. Then we had 57K net entry with 89K annual return. Then we had 29K net entry with 96K annual
that's the
return.
deal you have. Yeah.
So the total net out of pocket after tax savings was minus 25. So it was less than zero out of pocket. And then the total annual return is 241,000 on all three deals stacked together.
Yeah.
So this is where creative finance becomes very interesting because when you're getting that less than 10% entry on these properties, and if you maybe stack it with a seller carryback that's going to generate some capital into your overall portfolio, then you can create a net zero entry for all of the properties combined. This is where a lot of people look at the seller carrybacks and they're like, well, it might do minus 10K cash flow, and I'm not interested in that. If you stack them together with other cash flowing properties, or maybe you co-host and you get cash flow from co-hosting, those things can also generate cash flow that can offset a seller carryback, and you can take advantage of the tax savings and the capital generation that a seller carryback provides. That's where I really encourage people to look at their whole portfolio and not just individual properties, because each property can contribute in different ways to a portfolio. And we do have, and speaking of that, we have buyers who buy 6 properties at a time, which is virtually impossible to do if you're spending 20% down on a DSCR loan
Mm.
and 5% to furnish the property and 3% to close the property. You've got 28 to 35% into a deal. It's virtually impossible to do that at scale unless you have a significant amount of capital or unless you're raising capital from private money, which has other disadvantages because you're diluting your own equity and you're diluting your own cash flow by bringing on private money lenders. So this is buying creatively is a strategy that can work for people. It's a unique strategy. Of course, there are other strategies. I know, a lot of different strategies where people are, buying at certain price points and making sure the right amenities are there and they can generate a good amount of cash flow by having the right amenities and in the right market. And those are great strategies as well. And I did those as well. And I still look at those strategies, but the creative finance strategies really provide a lot of opportunity because you can get multiple of them quickly. Like I said, I have a $7 million portfolio of properties, and at 4% appreciation and 1% principal pay down, those are making 5% a year in equity, which is 350,000 in equity just on that portfolio, which can far outweigh anything that you're going to get from cash flow, even if you're really good at creating cash flow. You're never going to get close to that in a short amount of time to be able to generate like something that a portfolio that's going to provide you 350 to $500,000 a year in equity.
Absolutely, definitely. I mean, these are fantastic. Thanks a lot for responding to. I mean, explaining the whole deals. This makes so much